Håfa Day students, I am Governor Lou Leon Guerrero. Welcome to PBS University. Our friends at PBS Guam and the Guam Department of Education put this episode together with some fun and exciting learning material to help you keep up with your studies. So thank you for joining us on another learning adventure. Sidzus Masi and have a great listen.
Håfa Day, and welcome to this series about archaeology and ancient sites of the Mariana Islands. These episodes introduce the most current facts and findings from archaeological sites toward clarifying what we know versus what we do not know about how people lived in the islands throughout the last thousands of years. This knowledge can support diverse new discussions, perspectives, and interpretations. I hope that you like this series, and I look forward to learning more together.
Here we will continue the story of rediscovering and reconnecting with the museum collection of ancient artifacts, burial remains, and associated documentation known as the Hornbostel Collection at the Bishop Museum in Honolulu. This collection derived from the work of Hans Hornbostel in the Mariana Islands during the 1920s. Several aspects about the collection have been controversial, largely due to the issues of how the work had been performed at the time, and about how the public access has been managed since that time. Michael Bevacqua and Nicole Delisle Dueñas learned more about the Hornbostel collection. They developed new approaches for bringing this knowledge and experience into the present day.
I felt very fortunate. I felt bad for all of those who had tried to see the collection or get access to the collection in the past. So many people had mentioned the As Quiroga pictograph. Somebody had even told me that a long time ago it had been on display. But then at least they felt that after people from Guam had asked about it, eventually the Bishop Museum had hidden it away. I mean, this is what the person that I spoke to, they felt sort of had happened to it, and that over the years different people had asked to see it since then, and that had always been told that it didn't exist or they couldn't find it or they weren't allowed to see it or so on. And so I felt very privileged finally, and I'm hoping that it wasn't sort of just a fluke because of the program that we were in, but that this is something that'll lead to, like you said, a broader sort of conversation around repatriation, which hopefully can include the latte and then possibly some of the other items that they have in their collection.
When I entered the space, I did feel like a kind of like, oh, these are ours.
It felt overwhelming to see all of the sling stones, all of the adze heads. I definitely felt like angry towards Hornbostel, just because then when we looked at the catalog, where does this come from? And there's like no information. I was like, man.
Yeah, all the missing details. It was very obscene, like the amount of sling stones, all like marked with the number. Some of those numbers we might be able to go back and find out like where they are, but the details around like how it was found and exactly where it was placed, those things that would mean so much to us as descendants, right? All of that is missing. It really brings to mind how archaeology is done and how museum spaces can be decolonized and with, indigenous knowledge and indigenous people recentered.
So when we were thinking about our exhibit for the Weaving a Network of Care, we reflected on the latte that was in the Bishop Museum. And we had initially wanted to bring it into the exhibit itself, but there wasn't enough time. And so we decided to instead, thinking about all this history of displacement, of treasures taken, right? Of things lost, of sort of lack of access, we decided then that it would even, in a way, be even more fitting to comment on the latte as, which had been taken out of Guam, put at the Bishop Museum, that we would then sort of create an absence, present absence for it in our exhibit, to kind of then think about all of the ways that it was not in Guam, just in the same way that it is not in the gallery itself. It was really interesting because if we had been able to bring the latte from the bishop into the gallery for display, I don't know, it definitely could have had some meaning, for sure, but having the empty space was interesting because what Nicole did is that Nicole cut pieces of the Hornbostel catalog, the inventory, and then she used strips of that, and then she taped them around the shape of the Ipau latte. So the very same latte that we found behind the Bishop Museum, that Nicole had found the image of Hornbostel taking himself, so that Nicole drew that shape in the middle of the gallery, and then she surrounded it, the space, with the catalog. So it was literally surrounded by all of the things that Hornbostel had taken. The thing is that most of the exhibit was against the wall, right? So it didn't come out, but because of the size of the latte that was taken, it came out almost halfway into the space of the corridor where it was at. And so it was an interesting contrast then, because it's an absence, but because of the way we put it together, it had this presence. You had to walk around it. And that was kind of what we were going for, is that we wanted you to kind of encounter and feel the presence of the absence. So much of the history that we have been talking about, we wove into the exhibit. So the image of the latte being taken was kind of at the center. So was the image the newspaper article from the Honolulu Star Bulletin celebrating Hornbostel and the taking of the latte. On one side was the image that Nicole got from the library about the young boy taking the ads and trading it for the movie ticket. And what we did to fill the space, though, was to provide context for the history. We talked about, well, why is it that a young Chamorro child 100 years ago would trade a piece of their heritage for a movie ticket? So we talked about the history of colonization and how Chamorros became disconnected from these things, disconnected in many ways from these artifacts, that they saw them as part of an ancient past that they weren't firmly and intimately connected to, right? But then we also talked about, and along the bottom of the space, above where the circle, the absence of the latte had been carved out, we put the images of us visiting the latte and holding ceremony around the latte and where the latte is today. And this was meant to represent how things changed in terms of the Chamorro identity and attitudes and feelings of culture in the 20th century. So nowadays, if somebody was trying to kind of get you to buy stuff like that or trade in stuff like that, a lot of people would say, oh, hell no, this should go in the museum. Or no, this is part of our identity. This is part of our heritage, our culture. And so that's why, as Nicole mentioned earlier, the last piece that we added into it was a response to the initial image of the child trading the latte. We put in a drawing that my oldest child, Sumahi, did. I showed Sumahi the image of the young child trading in the ads for the ticket, and I said, what would you do in this situation? What would you do in this situation? And then sort of Sumahi then provided a response. Sumahi saw it in the way that a lot of younger people see these issues today around land and artifacts. They see the military, the US military, as being intricately and sort of tied up in these things, right? Because they hear about Latexan, they hear about maybe desecration of artifacts, they hear about jungle being destroyed, all of these things being lost. And so for Sumahi, instead of just a random ticket person giving the ticket, Sumahi then said, well, a military person giving a ticket, right? And then the movie, instead of some Marvel movie or, Hollywood movie, the movie is a recruiting poster for Uncle Sam saying, I want you, your land, for my bases. And so Sumahi then kind of reflects back and then so instead of handing it over, Sumahi looks at the ads, kind of pondering, what is its value? Is it worth it to hand it over? Sort of pausing to consider it.
Through this mini exhibit, within the exhibition, commenting on what had happened historically with Hornbostel's taking and how these injustices can be made right now, right, through repatriation and through knowledge of what happened, right? So, but also kind of bringing it further through Sumahi's piece and that comment on, what's happening now and how that connects to what had happened, 100 years ago. It was powerful in that not only having the presence of the absence and this comment on repatriation, but bringing it into what, we're dealing with now with the marine base construction and buildup and a destruction of jungles and desecration of Sabon and Fadang and Magwak, these ancient villages, right? The effects of militarization on ancient and ancestral settlements on Guam. Commenting on the history, but also bringing it to the present and connecting it to what's happening now and the issues that we face now and the things that we need to contemplate now, right? Like that's what the figure and Sumahi's artwork kind of contemplating what these artifacts or objects mean to us now today.
I think that's why the exhibit and our experiences with the Hornbostel collection, it's all part of this history, right? And we look back on that history. We want to inform people about it, right? But, this isn't the end of it, right? As Nicole said, our goal eventually is that the latte and other items be repatriated, right? But part of it, though, is remembering the changes that have taken place. What I always tell people is Chamorros during the Spanish period and in the early 20th century, they were very respectful of these artifacts. But if you ask them, as different people from the United States or Europe did, if you ask them, are these yours? Referring to like the latte, right? Or the sling stones and stuff. If people asked, are these yours? Chamorros would say, these are not ours. Ti idzon mami este idzon y tautau antes. These belong to the people of before. So when Chamorros were asked were at the ruins of latte houses, are these your houses? Chamorros would say, no, these are the houses of the people before. They're not ours, right? Which in some ways makes sense. But nowadays, if you ask a Chamorro, is this yours? Pointing to a latte, they will say, yes, this is part of who I am. Because of the way that we now have reconnected to the ancestors of the past. And we see ourselves not as there's this big divide between us and them that colonization brought. And so there's those before, and then there's us, and now there's us now. We see ourselves in greater continuity with those in the past. So that's why feeling the connection to these things, wanting them back, is stronger now. Because even if colonization disrupted and interfered with our feeling of connection and ownership and responsibility to these things, we have regained it. It has been remade. And so that's why the absence of the latte is so unsettling to us now, right? It's because rather than sitting behind the Bishop Museum, I would love it personally if we got it back and we could put it up, in the garden at the Guam Museum, or could put it back and set it up sort of somewhere at EPAL, right? Or somewhere like that, right? Let's bring it back here. And even in its repatriation, right? It's another chapter in the story that we have been talking about today.
I think the most important thing from this is now's the time to bring these artifacts home, to really take interest, but to also really protect what we have. I think that's probably the most important thing.
The history of the Chamorro people is every people has a complicated history in different ways, but within the Pacific, the Chamorro people have one of the more complicated histories in terms of colonialism and its impact. when we look at the Pacific, we see peoples who have dealt with a whole bunch of different things, but colonization and its impact starts earlier in the Marianas. European colonization begins earlier in the Marianas than it does anywhere else in the Pacific. And that's part of this history, right? Because I never want anyone to assume that this means that Chamorros care less about their culture or their land or something like that because all these artifacts were taken. But this is part of the complicated history of this, right? Is that colonizers come and they tell you that, oh, this is only important if you give it to me, right? Your land is important only if you use it for this, right? And we see then in the 20th century, Hornbostel comes and says, well, these things are valuable only if you give them to me. And some Chamorros probably didn't like that. Others probably said, sure, why not? We're not using it. Go ahead and take it. But that's why this history, though, is not just one of tragedy, though. So even though Chamorros are the most impacted by sort of colonization, that doesn't mean sort of that we need to wallow in tragedy about it, right? Because this is also a story of Chamorros learning to see past sort of those types of lies or misconceptions, right? It's also a history of Chamorros kind of looking to start trying to take back things that they had lost or things that were taken from them, right? Whether it is a sense of connection, right, to their past, right? So getting past the idea that your history begins when Magellan arrived at your shores. And part of this history is also us now saying, actually, our history went back thousands of years before that. Same thing with these things only matter if they're put in some collection on the other side of the world. These things matter too if they're brought into our own museums here. They also matter if they're just left in the ground where our ancestors left them, right? But seeing the new value, which is, seeing that value that it has for us in them. And so, I want people to just understand this is the history of the Chamorro people. And that the way that we are talking about it is filled with all the complications and the contradictions that all people experience. For me, it's just fascinating to talk about that, and it is inspiring them to think about children giving up sort of artifacts 100 years ago for movie tickets, and then for both me and Nicole, our children have protested sort of the U.S. military potentially mistreating human remains and artifacts today. This history is very political, but it's also very personal.
The efforts will continue for rediscovering, reclaiming, and redirecting the history associated with the Hornbostel collections. The experience so far can remind us about the importance of responsible research of archaeology and ancient sites, working toward the goal of making the materials and the knowledge accessible for people. Today, archaeologists are required to obtain permissions and permits for any excavation or similar work, in the same way that a land development project is required to follow the government laws and regulations about environmental and cultural impacts. In these respects, the local Historic Preservation Office plays a crucial role in the permitting process. As part of this process, archaeologists are encouraged to work with local communities, traditional cultural practitioners, and anyone who may be interested in the places or the themes that are being studied. However, people approach these issues in variable ways and with different results. In modern standards of practice, archaeologists are required to prepare their findings for curation in a museum, including not only the artifacts, but also the related information in maps, photographs, measurements, various kinds of analysis, comprehensive data tables and charts, a complete catalog of items, and a narrative report presentation. Although this extensive information does exist, extra steps would be necessary for bringing this information into the hands of the people who want to know about it. Otherwise, the artifact collections and the related documentation can be rendered inaccessible, or in extreme cases, neglected in curation storage or government office files. Some archaeologists, historians, and other researchers publish their work in peer-reviewed scientific journals and books. This output effectively brings the results permanently into the publicly accessible record. Nonetheless, the authors and the publishers are not always effective in making sure that people know about these resources. In any case, a genuine research project in archaeology, just like in any field of study, aims to share the results and the information. With this goal in mind, the documentation of the archaeological excavation or other study becomes the most important part of the work. Without this documentation, an excavation or a collection of artifacts would remove the potential source of knowledge from a site without delivering the benefits of the knowledge. Within the last several years, some efforts have concentrated on documenting sites in their natural context with little or no collection of the artifacts. In these cases, the emphasis is on documenting the facts in their own setting and then sharing the information content. This approach can help toward preserving the integrity of the site. Ideal cases can support public access for continuing education, experience, and other possibilities through respectful and guided site visits. Along with the published literature and guided site visits, museums often have been the primary access point for people to learn about archaeology and history. Currently, the Northern Mariana Islands Museum and the Guam Museum maintain exhibits about archaeology and history of the region, and they support programs for public outreach, education, and engagement. Additionally, the Guam Museum can manage a diversity of exhibits and programs about different topics. In my view, archaeologists should learn how to prepare their findings and their documentation, not just for curation in a storage facility, but also for integrating into a museum exhibit or another way of interfacing with the public and with the people who want to know about these findings. Often, people can contribute different ideas and perspectives that will improve the understanding and representation of the archaeological work. In my work, I keep in mind that all of the objects and records from my research will go into a curation facility. Realistically, I may not ever access those materials again. Eventually, people other than myself will be responsible for the ongoing curation maintenance and for representing the findings to the public. For a museum exhibit, I consider the key points from my research that changed or improved my knowledge about the past. How could I convey this information in a way that people can access? Specifically in a museum context, how could I translate the material facts and objects from the past for people to appreciate today? Traditionally, museums have been among the best ways for people to access information about archaeology. Within recent years, museums have been able to reach even more people through online videos and websites, living site museums, and other formats. People have addressed these issues about making archaeology accessible for the public in numerous ways. Each approach can be successful in certain conditions and circumstances, depending on the scope of the archaeological work and the characteristics of the public community. What have you experienced with these issues? What would you suggest for developing a museum exhibit, an educational opportunity, or a respectful site access program?
Thank you for joining us in learning about archaeology and ancient sites of the Mariana Islands. If you would like to access more details, then I encourage you to visit in person or online at the Micronesian Area Research Center of the University of Guam, or at the many other libraries, museums, and offices that work with historic preservation, archaeology, and ancient history. Thank you again for watching this program. I hope that you will continue to explore and discover more.
I'm Josh Tenorio, your Lieutenant Governor. Thank you for being with us today and for taking the time to continue your learning with PBS University. I also want to thank your teachers and support staff at DOE and PBS Guam for their work and their commitment to you, our students. Si Dus Maasi, and we hope that you enjoy this PBS University instruction.